Right, our first question is from Joseph, who asks, when should we expect to start seeing actual results from Labour's reforms and policies? The country seems to have stopped being actively destroyed, but things don't feel better yet.
Jolly good question, Joseph.
That's a cheerful way of looking at things. Things are no longer being actively destroyed.
We've just plateaued.
So I think in terms of the answer, one answer is, you look at what Wes Streeting is doing. You may agree or not, but he's certainly pushing ahead with big changes, big reforms on the NHS. And once we see primary care hubs starting probably as pilot schemes around the country, and we see waiting lists coming down, that's one answer. It's a big answer. Bridget Phillipson is doing a lot on breakfast clubs in schools and so on.
Although no sign of those new 6,500 teachers yet.
Not yet. Well, it'll take a time.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for me, one of the really interesting questions is actually benefit reform.
Yeah.
Because there is a huge problem here. We have an enormous increase in health-related benefits. More than a third of the entire working population now describe themselves as having a long-term health condition. That's 4 million more in the last decade, and the numbers are going up and up and up. It's already cost £12 billion. It's going to cost another 15 billion on top of that by the time of the next election. And if you look at the pressures on government, particularly at the moment on defence, I think this is completely unsustainable, and there is going to be a very, very difficult conversation about health benefit reforms in particular. The overall welfare budget, because what we used to call unemployment benefit is actually at its lowest level in real terms for, I think, 40 years, something like that. The overall welfare budget is not growing by very much, but inside that, health benefits are shooting up, and of course pensions are costing more and more because of the triple lock. So there's going to be a very, very big, difficult conversation, and Liz Kendall is going to start it very, very soon with a white paper called Get Britain Working, and they'll be followed by more specific proposals next year. I've been writing about that this week.
Yeah, you have been. And what do you expect to see? What are some of the changes you think might happen?
Well, I think a couple of things have to happen. They have to change the way the entire benefit system treats health-related benefits, because what's happening at the moment is you get a lot more money if you go on sickness benefits than if you just say that you're unemployed. And also on the unemployed side, there's much more conditionality. So the gap is more than £100 a week, first of all. So why wouldn't you claim sickness benefit if you possibly could? And second, on unemployment benefit, you're asked to apply for lots and lots of jobs per week. And if you don't, your benefits are docked and they go down and down and down. On sickness benefits, once you've been assessed, you're supposed to be reassessed quite regularly. But after the pandemic, the Conservatives cut those reassessments. So effectively, there's no conditionality. And so what we're doing is we're pushing people into sickness benefit. And once you're on sickness benefits, different kinds, then it's all about showing and demonstrating your incapacity for work, your inability to work, your unfitness for work. And that has two effects. It first of all ensures that you want to emphasize that how unwell you are, because otherwise you might lose your benefit. But secondly, I think you internalize that as well. So you decide that I'm a very sick person who can't possibly work. And I think that has a terrible effect on people's mental health in particular. A huge part, I think more than 60% of the increase in sickness benefit is mental-related benefits, stress, depression, and other specific conditions. And vast numbers of people seem to be coming straight out of education, out of school, out of college, and going straight on sickness benefits. And I think this is a catastrophe for the country, because we have a generation who haven't got the disciplines of work, haven't got the socializing that work gives you, haven't got, all those things that work brings us. They don't have. And if you don't get it in the first, 10 years, you probably will never have it. So this is going to be hanging around us as a country in terms of productivity and growth for a very, very long time. And finally, because I can feel myself going on a rant, I think, there is nothing socialist, there is nothing social democratic, there is nothing progressive, there is nothing caring by allowing so many of our fellow citizens to rot on sickness benefit. And that is Liz Kendall's big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great piece on newstatesman.com right now by Rachel Kelly, which touches on this theme of overdiagnosis, and a superb book coming out early in the new year by consultant neurologist Suzanne O'Sullivan, which talks about, actually, of course, some people have very serious illnesses, which means they cannot work and they need very strong medications, what have you. But there does seem to be overdiagnosis going on, misdiagnosis, and a lack of just exactly what you're talking about, Andrew, like a lack of research into or just thinking about what impact it has to label someone very early on in their life and how that might how that might affect their thinking and their entire approach to life.
I'm going to say something in defence of young people here. I just think that the conversation about young people coming out of school or out of university straight onto mental health benefits, you can't have that conversation without looking at the impact of the pandemic. And we like to kind of forget that the pandemic ever happened because it was traumatic for all of us. But the impact of lockdowns, of disrupted education, and of the sort of psychological pressure of being cut off from social networks impacted children, adolescents, significantly more than older people and adults. And I don't think that you can take those 3 years of complete and utter disruption out of the equation as to what might be going on with young people's mental health.
I think that's very well put and very well taken. But I would also say that, the same thing happened in France and Germany and the Netherlands, and they have not seen the same huge rise in people on sickness benefits. And I think that is because we have in this country created, perhaps by mistake, a system which encourages people to go on sickness benefit, and once they're there, encourages them to stay on it.
Can I do some other things that we might see progress on, just to try and lift the
bring it back to
conversation?
Joseph, yes.
So I think there are 2 different strands of this. One of this is extra funding and when we start to see the impact of extra funding. So big part of the health reforms are more NHS appointments and 40,000 new appointments, and those aren't being offered yet, but the funding for them was announced in the budget. Hannah, you mentioned the teachers. That's a Labour ambition because you kind of can't improve education outcomes if you don't have the teachers, but that's sort of core
from the VAT, isn't it?
But that's a sort of core policy. So I think that you will see that in this parliamentary term because that's like a measurable thing. Then there are other things that are legislative, which I think will have could have a very dramatic impact on people's lives if they're in that group. So the Renters Reform Bill, for example, is in the House of Lords at the moment, and I think is due to become law early next year, spring next year. If you're renting, the fact that no-fault evictions will be banned and sort of giving more rights and rebalancing the rights between tenants and landlords, that's going to be pretty seismic in improving your quality of life. If you're not renting, it's not really going to impact you. But renters as a group have been systematically ignored in favour of homeowners over many, many years. And there's also, of course, the New Deal for working people, the Employment Rights Bill, Angela Rayner's big thing. That was introduced to Parliament a couple of weeks ago, and that's going to be longer. They're doing the consultation next year, and I don't think those reforms are going to come in until 2026. But when they do, that's going to be a whole load of employment rights, like banning 0 hours contracts, making it harder to get rid of somebody sort of from day one, sick pay and maternity pay and all of that from day one. And that's going to have a huge impact if you are kind of caught up in that, which doesn't require the government to fund anything extra, of course. Small businesses and may say that it puts extra cost on them. So they're the things that require money, and there are the things that the government is trying to do to impact people's lives that don't require the Treasury dipping its hands in its pockets.
And I guess, to be fair, we are just 4 months into
a lot of that has been recess.
Yes.
It's early days. Yeah, I think that's what Rachel's saying is absolutely right. There's a whole tranche of reforms which we've heard about, have been talked about, but haven't actually impacted ordinary lives, but will quite soon.
One thing I do think about Labour's messaging, and the Conservatives are really good at this, Boris Johnson was really good at this, is that when there was a reform or an investment or something, he stuck his name on it. We still talk about Boris bikes, even though they're not Boris bikes anymore. Sort of making it very clear you got that funding or this investment was because of a Conservative government. I think Labour needs to sort of lay the groundwork for that and sort of make the point that if you're a renter who now is not going to be kicked out of your home, Labour did that for you.
Rachel's renters.
Yeah, it doesn't really
renters.
It doesn't slip off the tongue, does it? But I think that is important so that people associate the extra protections with the government.
Our next question comes in from a YouTube viewer who asks, why do you think anti-incumbent sentiment has been occurring on an international level in recent years? It almost feels like each country affected faces the same election issues as other countries that voted out an incumbent. it's something we've talked about a lot, isn't it, already on the podcast this year?
Because the West is, relatively speaking, declining. Because the challenges from this new globalized economy are being felt by working class communities from Rust Belt America through to East Germany, through to parts of Italy. It's happening everywhere. And that means that governments which happen to be in charge at the time don't have the big spending heft to make people's lives much better in the short term. They can't do much about immigration, the other big problem for those voters. And so they're being turfed out one after another.
I mean, Andrew's absolutely right, but that also includes countries that aren't in the West or that sort of have their own trends. And so I think it's that combined with, as I was saying a moment ago, the pandemic and watching governments trying to handle a new crisis that even if they did the best they possibly could, and we know that some countries performed better than others, I think all countries experienced some chaos, excess deaths, loss of liberty and all the rest of it. And I think voters blame their governments for the failures that they saw during the pandemic, even if that might be very unfair, because the governments were doing the best with the information they had.
Andrew?
Yeah, a lot of truth in that. I also wonder whether what we laughingly call social media, new media, is part of this, because the aggression and the ability to create anti-authority memes very, very fast is something that's happening everywhere. Is it a coincidence that this is going on at the same time when incumbent governments are losing more and more? I think not.
On the pandemic issue, there's, of course, those kind of social issues that you touch on, Rachel, but there's also what we have seen post-pandemic, and of course with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is staggeringly high, for us anyway, levels of inflation and economic insecurity. And, you know, we've seen in the US, haven't we, actually, that Joe Biden didn't too badly on the economy at all.
Their economy was doing well comparatively,
and
but they didn't feel like it was doing
inflation's
well.
come down, but what extent do you think that's played in?
We should note this week of all weeks that inflation is going back up again.
Yeah.
Not very fast yet, but it's quite a jump. And I think most economists would assume that if Trump does what he says he's going to do on extra government spending and on tariffs, we are going to see a new wave of inflation hitting the rest of the world as well. So inflation is not going away. That's a really, really serious problem for us. I had a conversation with a member of the cabinet who's pretty close to Keir Starmer at the beginning of the week, and I heard for the first time the words, "Do you know, Andrew, I think we may be a one-term government." So this is something that is rattling ministers as well as everybody else.
Wow, this early on. Crikey.
I wonder if some of it that maybe goes back further to the financial crisis and sort of 2007, 2008, just because I think that was a moment, particularly across the West, where ordinary people really, really lost out. And it felt like, I mean, I was a teenager, so correct me if this assessment is not accurate, but it felt certainly at the time like the elite, the bankers, the financial system were kind of all okay and were bailed out, and the living standards of ordinary people sort of dramatically went down, and people, particularly in the US, have lost their houses. And I don't think that, certainly in the UK, we've recovered either our trust in the government or the kind of economic boom, the productivity, the sense that we're going through a tough time, but things will get better. I don't think that things necessarily have got back on the right track since 2008. And I think that the electorate, certainly we saw this with the Conservatives, and the way voters have got sick of austerity and this idea that we'd sacrificed and sacrificed and sacrificed. Now it's time to have more spending. Now the economy hasn't picked up in a way that enables them to do that. So there is a disconnect between what voters think they have been through and what they expect their governments to do and the resources that the governments actually have.
I partly agree with that. I think it's much more to do with austerity than the actual financial crisis itself, because at that moment we were quite close to losing the entire banking system. And I think when Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown intervened in the way they did, there was huge support for that at the time and a great relief. We're very, very good at avoiding a crisis and then immediately forgetting about it. But I think that was a very important moment. I think the real change was what followed with the Cameron government and Osborne's austerity. In other words, that was the punishment. That was the punishment beating, I think, of an awful lot of ordinary people and a lot of public services.
Rachel's right. It was the ordinary people that got punished.
That's what I'm saying.
But they played no part
exactly.
in bringing about the
Exactly.
the
Very,
problem.
very few of them were international bankers, it's true.
But it is interesting, isn't it? Because traditionally, I mean, incumbents tend to hold the upper hand in elections. They've got the name recognition. You've often got the financial advantage.
Because they've got the financial advantage, but there isn't a financial advantage at the moment because they can control the media, but they can't control the media anymore because the media has changed. So a lot of those traditional advantages, you're quite right to mention them, Hannah, have gone.
Do we see, I mean, one country that's obviously hoping to buck this trend in their elections next week is Ireland. And we recorded a show about that on Wednesday, Sinn Féin's growing pains. The link will be in the show notes. But do you think moving forward, as our viewer says, are we going to see many more changes of administration? It's you've said. I mean, this Labour government already are fearing there'll be a one-term government, but is there just less stability in politics now globally?
It all depends the extent to which we, as it were, mature in our understanding of what's going on around us, and the extent to which this kind of inchoate, genuine, furious anger carries on rolling. Same person said to me, I hope the Conservatives revive a bit. We need them to do that. And I said, why? And he said, because reform is waiting in the wings. They may only have a few MPs now, but they've got very strong performance in the polls. And if we get a sense over the next 4 years that Labour has failed to deliver, has made promises and broken them, and broken lots of different communities, if we get a sense above all the economy hasn't grown, that working people are not feeling any better off, then the next election will be much wilder than the one we've just been through in the summer.
Yeah, I think it's worth sort of stressing that our political system in the UK benefits the incumbent parties, so not necessarily the government, but Labour and the Conservatives, because of first past the post. And that means that it crowds out insurgent parties from the left and the right that would normally capitalise on anti-establishment support. If you look at the more proportional representation electoral systems across Europe, you're seeing the trend quicker in the sense that the sentiment is translating into election results in a way that it didn't here in the last election, because Labour got a huge majority on a smaller proportion of the vote. But I think if the trend keeps building, that's not going to hold, and first past the post as a system is not going to be enough to stop the sort of wave of anti-establishment sentiment that says both the main parties, they're as bad as each other, let's try something new.
It's interesting. I mean, obviously not every incumbent government has fallen, but when you look at the places where voter share has increased for the incumbents, places like Mexico, Finland, Moldova, Dominican Republic, it's when you look at what's going on, I don't claim to be an expert on these countries, but they've managed to increase their share on the back of concerns over really serious social issues like gang violence, Russian encroachment. It's about fear. It feels there's not much to be happy about right now.
One of the cards that Starmer does still have, I think, is this kind of mildly authoritarian, kind of tough guy, sort of ex-lawyer, ex-prosecutor image. And I think if he persuades Yvette Cooper in the Home Office to do something quite substantial on street-level crime, then the notion that we may not like these people, but they're kind of strong and they give a sense of authority and direction may well help him.